Parkinson's Research Interest Group, I'd like to welcome you to this first Meet the Researcher online hour. I'm very excited to welcome Claire Bale, who is the head of research communications and engagement within the Parkinson's UK team, here with us to talk on the topic, why is there no cure yet? Claire was originally planning to hold this talk at a face-to-face meeting at the Masters Arms in Woodbury, Devon on March 25th. Unfortunately, as you all know, we had to cancel that event due to the COVID-19 crisis. I'm very happy to that Claire has agreed to hold this talk with us today. There'll be a 50-minute presentation by Claire, and after that there'll be a Q&A session where members of the PenPRIG team will be asking questions that have been submitted by our supporters, but also by the ticket holders of the original March 25th event. So with that, I'll hand over to Claire for her presentation.
Thank you, Uli. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm really happy we're trying out using technology to deliver talks remotely. And I will do my very best to, in 15 minutes, explain some of the reasons why there isn't yet a cure for Parkinson's. So, how do I make my slide move? There we go. First of all, I thought it would be sensible to quickly talk about what we mean by a cure. I think it's a very emotive word, and many people will have different ideas and personal ideas of what a cure would mean to them. I've suggested 3 possible definitions here on the screen. Treatments that could mean living free from the symptoms of Parkinson's might be some people's idea of what a cure is. Others might visualize it as being treatments that can repair and reverse the damage that's already been done in Parkinson's. Other people might imagine it as something that could prevent Parkinson's and almost eradicate the condition in the future. So perhaps, you know, like a vaccine. With vaccines, we've managed to eradicate some diseases. But you may have a very different idea yourself. At Parkinson's UK, we usually think of a cure as being something that would mean people who have Parkinson's can live entirely free of the symptoms and side effects of the condition. And because Parkinson's varies so much from person to person, we also believe that a cure is unlikely to be one single treatment that works for everyone and fixes all the problems that can occur in Parkinson's. For that reason, we think it might actually require a range of different therapies to tackle the symptoms and also the underlying processes involved in the condition. So things that can slow and stop the progression of the illness, treatments that could repair the damage that has already been done, treatments that can control and help to manage particular symptoms that might be bothersome. And also this might also need to be paired with a better diagnosis, a way to spot Parkinson's earlier so that we have the opportunity to use these treatments to their maximum value. And these treatments themselves might vary quite widely. So they could be surgical treatments, drug treatments, and also things in our lifestyle like changes to nutrition and increasing the amount and types of exercise that we do. So perhaps a cure is a little more complex than a simple pill for Parkinson's. But how are we doing, and what are the real challenges in achieving this lofty goal? So I'm going to talk about 5 key challenges. There are probably others as well, but these are the ones that I've identified that I think really are some of the key challenges. And I'm also going to talk about how the international community is trying to tackle these. So the first one might be rather obvious, but we don't actually know why people get Parkinson's in the first place yet. We know that in people with Parkinson's, dopamine producing cells in the brain are lost gradually over time, but we do not have a complete understanding of how and why that happens. So if you imagine you're trying to fix a car, if your car's broken down and you need to get it going again, you first need to identify why it's broken down. What is the part of the car that's not functioning properly, and how do you replace it or repair it? And the same thing we need to be able to do in Parkinson's. And we do know what part of, or we think we know what part of the brain is going wrong, but we don't actually know how it's going wrong and how we can actually address that. But phenomenal progress has been made, particularly in the last 10 to 20 years. We've made breakthroughs in genetics, in molecular biology, which means we have discovered many of the pieces of the puzzle in Parkinson's. And actually, these pieces we think are so crucial that we're already starting to develop treatments based on them. So things like problems with mitochondria, there are now, which are the little energy producing batteries inside cells. We're now starting to develop treatments that can hopefully help those mitochondria work better. And the same with genetics and many other aspects of things that may be going wrong inside brain cells. But we still believe there are more puzzle pieces to find, and also that we need to be able to piece them together to get our complete picture of how and why brain cells are lost in Parkinson's. And actually that picture may be slightly different from person to person, but definitely there's been a revolution in our understanding here, and we are getting closer and closer to that understanding. The second big challenge, I think, is diagnosis. So by the time clear symptoms of Parkinson's emerge, things like tremor, slowness, and stiffness that are really key signs of the condition, we believe that already a lot of damage has been done. Up to 50% of the brain cells are already struggling and in trouble. In other conditions like cancer, we know how important early detection is. If we can detect cancer early, we have a much better chance of successful treatment. And we believe the same will be true in Parkinson's in the future. Another crucial problem about diagnosis is that it's not 100% accurate in Parkinson's. It's based on a clinical assessment, and the judgment of a specialist is required, but they can't see inside the brain and tell exactly what's going on. And the only 100% accurate way to diagnose it is post-mortem analysis after someone's passed away, their brain is examined. Obviously, that's not good enough. So we need to be able to diagnose it more accurately. We actually think that up to 1 in 10 people may be initially misdiagnosed with Parkinson's. So if you think about it, if you're doing a clinical trial in 1,000 people, testing a new treatment that you think might be, really transformative for people with Parkinson's, but you have 100 people in your clinical trial who do not have Parkinson's, you can imagine that that would really mess up your trial potentially, because they're unlikely to benefit from the treatment. So for these reasons, developing new and better ways to diagnose Parkinson's is a really big area of research across the world in Parkinson's, and there is great progress being made on a number of fronts. So researchers are trying to develop blood tests, smell tests, better ways to do brain imaging. You may also have heard of Joy Milne and her ability to smell Parkinson's. So researchers are exploring that in further detail, and we are making gradual progress towards these better tests. We're also funding a large project called Predict PD, where we're following people without Parkinson's who are aged 60 to 80 to understand what the very early warning signs may be and how we could pick those up as early as possible. The next challenge is that Parkinson's may not be just one condition. We know that everyone with Parkinson's can be very different. You've probably heard people say no two people with the condition are alike. And if everyone has their own unique version of Parkinson's, the particular symptoms are different and how they progress and also how they respond to treatments. That makes developing new treatments and ultimately a cure very challenging. So if it is, and this idea that Parkinson's is actually not just one condition, but many forms of the same condition with subtypes, that's gaining traction in the research community, and researchers are now turning their attention to understand how we can separate Parkinson's into subtypes. And we're gaining some success here. So one area that seems to be bearing fruit is we have funded 2 major studies in the UK tracking Parkinson's. and also the Oxford Parkinson's Disease Centre's Discovery cohort that have followed thousands of people with Parkinson's in total over time to see how their symptoms first present and how they develop over time. By pooling their data, they've been able to identify 4 clusters that seem to have distinct symptoms when they're first diagnosed and to progress in very particular ways. Now, these clusters are still very early. They've recently been identified and they need to be further studied and validated in other populations, but they could be the start of us being able to identify types of Parkinson's. And if we can do this, it will help us not only to treat Parkinson's better, but to do better trials, because we'll be able to identify the right patients and the right treatments for those patients. Okay, next challenge. We cannot measure Parkinson's. So there are many efforts underway to develop disease-modifying treatments for Parkinson's. So these would be treatments that could slow or stop the progression of the condition. But the challenge is we cannot really measure Parkinson's. It's very hard to actually see, because it's a condition that progresses fairly slowly over time. How can you tell whether someone is getting better or worse? It's quite hard to tell that. In clinical trials at the moment, how we do it is we take 2 groups of people who may be very variable across those groups, and we used measurements like clinical assessments where people, go into the doctors every month or every 2 or 3 months and walk up and down, tap their fingers together, tap their toes, and the clinician makes an assessment of what their Parkinson's is like at that point in time. But we all know that Parkinson's symptoms can vary, not just day to day or month to month, but hour to hour. So depending on how that person is on that particular day where they're having their assessment, could really, the score that they get could really vary. And it's not an all-round view of how their Parkinson's really is. And obviously, if you're comparing these 2 groups, that assumes that the 2 groups really are equal. And actually, we know that that's very hard to achieve in Parkinson's as well. So far in these kinds of trials, we haven't really cracked it. We haven't been able to show that any of the new treatments being developed really can slow or stop the progression of the condition. And one of the problems is we cannot really predict how Parkinson's will progress. So if you take someone with Parkinson's today, how do you know what they'll be like in a year or 2 years' time? Some people's condition progresses quite slowly, others more quickly. So how can you tell if that particular individual's condition has been slowed? So this is a really major challenge for the research community, but one that they are tackling. So we're trying to develop better ways to measure Parkinson's, and they tie back to some of the things I was talking about in terms of diagnosis. So blood tests and brain scanning technologies are being developed to do this. But also digital or wearable technologies are being explored as well. So could people with Parkinson's actually wear devices like little Fitbit type devices on their wrists and maybe other places as well on their bodies to measure how their symptoms are, not just in a short window of time at a doctor's appointment, but 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, to give a much more rounded picture of how that person's Parkinson's symptoms are and how they're affecting their daily lives. And not just their movement symptoms either. I think there's a lot of progress being made to develop technologies that can measure other things like sleep, for example, and even ways to measure things like anxiety by measuring things like heart rate and cortisol levels, things like this. So those are 2 approaches. Also, the Critical Path for Parkinson's project, which is something that Parkinson's UK is trying to pool data from studies and trials that have been carried out already in Parkinson's. We have the data from over 10,000 patients in the database, and this is being used to create a computer model of how Parkinson's progresses that could help us do that thing that I was saying we can't do at the moment, predict how an individual with Parkinson's might be in 1 year or 2 years' time. So that instead of comparing two groups in a clinical trial, we could compare people based on their own data at the start of the trial and how we expect them to be in 2 years, and see if actually their condition is slowed compared to that. So huge progress again being made in this area, but it is a really tricky problem and it's hard to know exactly when we will crack it. And then the final challenge I've got here, and again, one you may have been expecting, is that we need more investment in Parkinson's research if we're going to achieve a cure. And not just more investment, we need to make sure we're investing money in the right places. So there's, as you can see on my slide, hopefully, there's a lot of work going on in the early stages of research. So at the left-hand end of the graph in basic science and academia. And that's why we've made such a tremendous progress in developing our understanding of Parkinson's, understanding the pieces of the puzzle that may be involved in why and how Parkinson's developed. There's also a lot of resources available at the other end of the spectrum, at the industry, in terms of doing the final touches of developing new treatments, testing them in large scale clinical trials. But where there may be a gap is in the middle there, and it's rather morbidly called the valley of death. But this is the part of research which is translating those discoveries in the lab and turning them into the early starting points of new treatments, early drug molecules, for example, because industry don't tend to get involved in that very early drug discovery work these days. And to get them over this hump, if you like, get them through the valley of death, we have created our Parkinson's Virtual Biotech, which you may have heard of before. And the idea is we are looking for the best opportunities and ideas that could be Parkinson's treatments in the future, and we're trying to do that early stage work to get them to the point where they may be picked up by larger companies or industry bodies who can take them forward into the later stage, very expensive clinical trials. There are other initiatives as well going on around the world. Our Critical Path for Parkinson's also is trying to overcome some of the issues that might be preventing industry investing in Parkinson's research, making clinical trials more productive, more efficient, and more likely to succeed. And then there are also initiatives like the Aligning Science Against Parkinson's, which is quite a new initiative. It's funded by the Sergey Brin Foundation. So Sergey Brin is one of the founders of Google, so has quite deep pockets. And he has actually discovered that he has a genetic link to Parkinson's. So he has a personal vested interest in the research. And the Aligning Science Against Parkinson's is really very much at the left-hand end of this graph. It's about bringing together all those jigsaw puzzle pieces internationally, getting scientists to work together to figure out how they go together and to identify the missing pieces, so that we have the best basis on which to build new treatments. Another one I wanted to mention is the Cure Parkinson's Trust's Linked Clinical Trials Initiative, which is looking to coordinate globally how we do repurposing trials for Parkinson's, so that we can do those as effectively and in as joined up a way as possible. So great efforts are being made globally and collaboratively to identify the best places to invest research funds that will strategically make the biggest difference to accelerating new and better treatments for Parkinson's. And it's great to see that so many new initiatives and collaborative initiatives starting here. So I think that is my very speedy whistle-stop tour of 5 reasons why we don't yet have a cure for Parkinson's. And I'm going to pause now and I believe hand over to the PenPRIG group for some questions.
Yes, thanks very much, Claire, for this presentation. And yes, as you mentioned, we now come to a small Q&A session. We have collected input from the original ticket holders of the March event and our supporters team, and we have a panel of members of the PenPRIG team online listening to us, and they will ask the questions and briefly introduce themselves. So I'll try and ask the first question. This was around the four subtypes or different types of Parkinson's that you mentioned, and there's really a threefold question. It says, on one hand, could Parkinson's actually be a syndrome with several conditions being grouped together due to similar observable features? Are these subgroups defined only by phenotype, i.e. the range of symptoms a person presents with? If so, what efforts are being made to pull together common features of genetics, past medical history, and environmental exposure to chemicals, etc., to explore that further?
Really great question. So the four clusters I mentioned that have been suggested by the Oxford and Tracking Parkinson's groups are based primarily on phenotype, so the clinical symptoms that people are presenting with when they first diagnose, but also how those evolve over time. But there are other groups and approaches looking at it the other way around, so looking at the underlying biology to try and find if there are ways to biologically separate people into groups. And actually, ultimately, we hope these two things will align so that we can see, okay, so people develop different kinds of symptoms and a different form of the condition, and that's related to the underlying biology and the reasons why they have Parkinson's. But yes, that's, you know, ultimately what you're saying. Yes, it could be that Parkinson's is a syndrome rather than a single condition. And actually, it may be a bit of a spectrum that overlaps with other conditions as well. I think we like to put people in boxes, and Parkinson's is a neat box, although we all know there's a lot of variability within it. And that's probably true in many other neurodegenerative conditions. And actually, they're all much more interconnected than we currently depict them. So yes, exactly that. And also, I think things like our Predict PD project, which is gathering lots of data from people who are not yet diagnosed with Parkinson's, is asking lots of questions about lifestyle, things like exposure to chemicals is, I think, included in their surveys, and about the early symptoms that people might or might not be experiencing, things like loss of sense of smell, REM sleep behavior disorder, so this condition where people act out their dreams. We know that people who have that are around 80% of them will develop some sort of degenerative illness, and often that is Parkinson's. So there are all these kinds of connections between different conditions are things we need to explore as well.
Good morning, and for the benefit of the tape, this is Chris Maycock speaking. As you pointed us to, we're becoming used to drug trials that report no significant difference compared with placebo. However, we also know of individuals, we call them outliers, who responded very well or very poorly, or in ways not anticipated in the trial design. So a couple of questions. Firstly, how far away are we from focusing on these outliers to find out what is common amongst those who find the drug useful? And secondly, is enough information being gathered from trial participants to find these commonalities, for example, collecting genetic material from everyone who attends a trial? Over to you.
Another excellent question. So, and it ties in a bit with the subtypes of Parkinson's issue as well. So in clinical trials, recent clinical trials that have delivered these inconclusive or unsatisfactory results, maybe the GDNF trial is quite a good example, where ultimately we didn't see a clear difference between people on GDNF and people on placebo, but there was a great variability in the response. Some people responding fantastically well, others much less so. And there was quite a lot of retrospective analysis to try and identify, was there any clear basis for why some people were responding well and others not, but they weren't able to identify anything. And I think that's probably quite connected to the fact it was a small study. There was only 41 participants, so how do you spotting patterns in 41 people is very difficult to do. So the critical path for Parkinson's, which I've already mentioned, which is bringing together data from trials and studies all over the world and looking at it together gives us the power to try and do that better. So to see, you know, in clinical trials, we've seen certain people responding really well to certain kinds of therapies, but if we pool all of that data, it gives us much more power to identify what the underlying reasons for that might be. And that's exactly what they're trying to do through that project, and the 10,000 people's data. So yes, we're trying to do that, but we're also trying to do it, so that's retroactively, if you like, identifying people after the fact. But there's also a lot of attention now in clinical trials into how do we identify the right participants to go into the trial in the first place that are most likely to benefit from the therapy. And so there's steps being made in this direction, particularly with some of the new treatments that aim to target the genetic factors involved in Parkinson's. So there are new trials starting now looking to address LRRK2 mutation Parkinson's, and also GBA, another genetic form of Parkinson's. And some of the trials involve both people with LRRK2 mutations and without. And same on GBA side, but they are trying to encourage people with the LRRK2 or GBA to participate, because these people are more likely to respond to the therapies, and there's a clear biological basis there for why it would work better for them. So I think this is just the start. We're going to see much more enrichment in clinical trials in future, so much more careful attention paid to who goes into them in the first place. And then on your question about collecting more information around genetics and so on, yes, that's definitely a move in the field. So I think it's almost all new clinical trials will be looking to collect samples to allow for genetic analysis, but also increasing numbers of trials are collecting lumbar puncture. So that's cerebrospinal fluid, so they can look at sort of biomarkers in the cerebrospinal fluid, and other samples as well, potentially. So lots more biological sampling and lots more imaging. Brain imaging is also a very important part of it as well, so that we can get as much information from each participant as possible, to enable us to learn as much as we can from every trial. Hope that answers the question.
Good morning, Claire. I'm Ian O'Neill, and I'm part of the Peninsula group, very recently joined. When you mentioned the Valley of Death, I was thinking, how reliant is a cure based on commercial interest? Why should Big Pharma try to find a cure when it's surely more sustainable and profitable for their businesses to sell drugs for symptoms? And I was reading about that yesterday in America, quite frightening. If research is just commercially led, how effective is worldwide cooperation?
This is a really, thank you, Ian. This is a really, I think, a common question, or one that I see a lot on the internet, and it's really good to be able to discuss it. So it's an interesting one. There are actually many large companies who are investing substantially in treatments that are not necessarily a whole cure, but are certainly things that are aiming to slow, stop, or reverse Parkinson's. So a few examples. So the Swiss pharmaceutical company Roche are investing in a vaccine-based approach for Parkinson's, which is currently in phase 2 trials. GlaxoSmithKline are investing heavily in developing LRRK2 inhibitors. And as you probably, or some of you may know, Pfizer, which I think are the largest pharmaceutical company in the world, were poised to invest in the next stages for the GDNF had it been successful, which clearly is a hopefully disease-modifying approach, something that could slow, stop, and reverse Parkinson's. So clearly companies are interested in investing in these disease-modifying approaches. And I think the current symptomatic therapy, and they're also investing in new symptomatic therapies as well. But the symptomatic therapies, while a lot of the ones that we have now are fairly old, they are actually either not patented anymore or nearing the end of their patents. And that means that the companies who originally developed them are losing their ability to make money out of them, because other companies are now starting to be able to make generic versions. And a lot of the symptomatic therapies that are being developed by companies now are aiming to tackle more niche aspects of Parkinson's, so things that don't necessarily affect everyone, things like dyskinesia or hallucinations that obviously are really important treatments for many people with Parkinson's, but they're unlikely to have the same market as a disease-modifying treatment that could potentially work for the whole population. So I think there is actually a bit of a race on in the pharmaceutical industry to develop the first disease-modifying treatment for Parkinson's. It would be a blockbuster drug. It would be something that they could make a big financial return out of. They'd be able to negotiate strongly for high prices from providers like the NHS, although obviously there'd be lots of people arguing for them to be affordable. So I think there is a financial incentive, a really strong financial incentive for companies to develop disease-modifying treatments for Parkinson's. And we're also seeing a lot of and growing actually interest from pharmaceutical industry in Parkinson's generally. So our Critical Path for Parkinson's program, I think, has 10 or 11 large pharmaceutical companies signed up who contribute financially to support the program and contribute data, expertise and time to helping to build the tools that the program is creating to improve clinical trials. So there is a great effort actually to develop curative type treatments in the pharmaceutical industry, and I think it can be a bit of a misnomer that they're not interested in that. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you very much, Claire.
Good. Oh, I didn't answer the bit about worldwide cooperation. Maybe I'll just quickly touch on that as well. I think and it being commercially led. So I don't think that Parkinson's research should be or is entirely commercially led. It's an ecosystem, and I think we have to involve everyone in that. But if anyone should be driving Parkinson's research forward and making decisions or deciding what's most important, it's not companies, clearly, it's patients, people with Parkinson's. And this is also a definite move that we're seeing. Patients are becoming more and more visible and powerful in terms of their voice at the table in research. You may have heard of patient and public involvement or patient engagement. These are becoming terms that are really present in research, not just at universities, but also in industry. And we're seeing more and more companies coming to Parkinson's UK saying, we want to work with people affected by Parkinson's to develop our research programs, to understand what they want, so that we can develop, they know they need to develop treatments that people with Parkinson's want. There's no point in them developing treatments that people with Parkinson's won't take or don't need. So they need to work with patients to be relevant, basically, and develop the treatments that you need. So I think it's a really exciting time because there's so much opportunity for patients to influence the landscape and influence the research that's being done. So yeah, I think it's exciting. And the doors are opening up and there's much more collaboration, and patients are driving that as well. They're saying, we don't want to see you working in silos, we want you to see you working together, and you're much more powerful than maybe you realize, and getting more powerful.
Okay, thank you for the extra bit at the end there, Claire. Yeah, I really am quite concerned that Parkinson's doesn't get the sort of press support, shall we say the cancer does, for instance. And I think that there's still probably quite a lot of work there that we all can do.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Shouting louder and together will help us do that.
Thank you, Claire. It's my turn now, and I'm Sue Whipps, one of the early members of the PenPRIG organisation. You told us about the 3 possible meanings of cure. And my question is the Parkinson's UK Virtual Biotech company concentrating on any particular area? And how does the biotech company engender international cooperation?
Thanks, Sue. So first, I just want to clarify that the Parkinson's Virtual Biotech, which is a Parkinson's UK initiative, isn't actually a company. what it is it's trying to use the same kinds of approaches as companies do in terms of the scientific approach and the kind of professionalism and the focus that a company will use to drive forward a program is a bit different to how research happens in academia, in universities and hospitals. So we're trying to work with that same professionalism and focus as a company does, but we're not, the Parkinson's Virtual Biotech is not driving towards a profit. Its only interest is developing treatments that are useful and helpful to people with Parkinson's. In terms of its whether it's going after a particular particular kind of treatment, it's not actually. It's keeping it's got a very broad focus and remit. We're interested in projects that have the potential to deliver treatments both disease modifying and also symptomatic. So the portfolio at the moment, we have about 5 active projects. I think 3 are early stage projects in the lab that are developing hopefully disease modifying approaches for Parkinson's, and we have two trials coming up which unfortunately have been paused by the COVID-19 situation, but will be starting later this year hopefully, that are both looking to develop symptomatic therapies for Parkinson's. And the reason that we've got this broad approach is because we think that reflects what our broad and diverse community wants Parkinson's UK to do. We know how important it is that we ultimately cure Parkinson's in the future, but we also know that we desperately need better ways to manage the condition right now. So we're looking at every possible avenue, and we're looking as well to find ways we can better involve people with Parkinson's in making decisions in the virtual biotech. We have done some in the past, but I think it needs to be more transparent and it needs to be more open so that people with Parkinson's can feel a bit more connected to it. Because I think there is this impression that it is a company operating sort of slightly outside of Parkinson's UK, when actually it's very core and it's very much based and driven completely on what people with Parkinson's are telling us is important to them. So hopefully that answers the question.
Can I just come back to the bit about international cooperation?
Yes.
Are you pulling ideas from other countries and are you stimulating research in other countries?
Yes. So one thing that is different about the Parkinson's Virtual Biotech compared to our university grants program, which sometimes grants money outside the UK, but is very UK focused. The Parkinson's Virtual Biotech is intended to be a very global and outward-looking initiative. So currently, I think, well, we have already invested in projects that are outside the UK through the Virtual Biotech. So there was a project with a biotech in the US that was looking at a treatment for dyskinesia. But now we're getting more, as our name is getting bigger and more known in the international community, we're being approached and starting discussions with researchers and companies dotted all over the world. So actually, as far away, we've actually got some active discussions happening about a potential project based in New Zealand, and also with Australia. One of our current drug discovery projects, although we're managing it, some of the work is being outsourced to a company in China. So we're working with providers of scientific, these are contract research organizations that do the donkey work, although it's much more complicated than donkey work, obviously, but we'll find the best provider wherever they are in the world, not just looking at the UK. The other thing is we want it to be a collaborative initiative with other organizations. So the Parkinson's Foundation, which is a very large charity in the United States, have actually partnered with us through the Virtual Biotech and invested £200,000 so far in the program. And we're hoping to bring more partners like that, funding partners, on board internationally in the next year or so as well, so that we can just expand what we're doing and do it together rather than all of us working individually.
Hi Claire, this is Nigel Coleman here, East Devon representative from PenPRIG. I have a couple of COVID-19 related questions actually, and you've touched upon it already. First of all, sort of what is the effect expected to have on PD research long term? You've mentioned the stalling, and perhaps you could comment on sort of your thoughts long term. And is there an upside? The global sort of efforts now bringing the science and the world community together a little bit more. Will that have a positive effect for PD research in the future? Thank you.
Thanks, Nigel. Yes, this is an issue that's uppermost in all of our minds at the moment. In terms of the short term, firstly, it is having an effect. So a lot of labs, well, pretty much all universities have shut their labs, so our researchers are not able to do their experiments. Hospital-based projects are obviously very impacted as well, because the people who work in hospitals are being redeployed to fight coronavirus, and because of social distancing measures, it's just not possible to do face-to-face research with people with Parkinson's at the moment. But on the positive side, even in the short term, we're seeing researchers being incredibly resourceful and creative in managing to continue research wherever they can and turning their attentions to things that they can do from home. So we're seeing researchers reaching out to others globally to host seminar series on Zoom like we're doing today. We're actually doing one later today with some of our researchers, and looking to do a data analysis that they can get on with at home, planning future research projects, and basically they're keeping themselves busy and ready to get back into the lab as soon as they can. We're also seeing some of our projects that involve people with Parkinson's continue. So the Predict PD project, which I mentioned, they are carrying on. It's mainly an online study, but the aspects that aren't online, they're managing to find workarounds for. So it's a great thing, actually. I think there's lots of positives coming out even right now in terms of how researchers are carrying on and using creative ways and technology to manage to continue to do their work and get people with Parkinson's involved as well. The longer term impacts are harder to predict. I guess one of the most obvious and worrying ones for us is financial. You know, we know in the short term our fundraising is going to be affected by the crisis. We're not, you know, the London Marathon was supposed to be happening last weekend, and there's a huge fundraising event for all charities. And many other fundraising activities have had to be paused, which will put a dent in our 2020 income. But we don't know whether the fundraising challenges will continue beyond the end of coronavirus, and it kind of depends on lots of factors, economics and things. So it's possible that fundraising will be challenging for some time to come, and obviously not just for us, but for all funding bodies around the world, because this is a global pandemic. But certainly we also see there being potential upsides, absolutely. So I think we're seeing through the coronavirus crisis, scientists stepping up, just like our NHS staff are, collaborating in ways they haven't before, and also publishing at a much faster pace. So one of my frustrations is that sometimes researchers will have great results and it takes a long time for them to come out. The GDNF trial was a good example of it taking a long time for those results to be published and shared with people affected by Parkinson's, but also the wider scientific community. And in the coronavirus pandemic, researchers have kind of thrown that whole way of doing science out and of just publishing their results as they get them to share with everyone, because we're all working on the same problem. And I really think, I mean, that could be an amazing step forward for science if we can take some of that urgency in terms of sharing data and results more collaboratively and more quickly. That could be really positive for all science, but Parkinson's certainly. Another thing I think could be a real silver lining is just the way that we're all using technology more now. It opens up the possibility of using technology more in clinical trials in future, making research more accessible to people who live in rural areas, for example. You know, can we have telemedicine appointments, so appointments over Zoom, rather than getting participants to travel, you know, miles and miles to the hospital to participate. So just thinking of different ways to do things, I think it's really expanded our minds in terms of how we could structure clinical trials in future as well. So I think there are definitely, hopefully, things that we're learning that we can continue to apply to research in the future.
Right, I think we've come to the end of our questions and the end of our session today. So I just want to spend the last few minutes, I guess, first of all, thanking Claire Bale to spend the time, who spent the time with us and pulled this presentation together and answered all the questions that we've had. I'd like to thank everybody at Parkinson's UK who's been working in the background to help us pull this together. And last but not least, I want to thank my colleagues at the PenPRIG team who you've met during the panel session. As a group of volunteers, we're always looking at recruiting additional members to help us. So if you're interested, please let us know. And again, as a group of volunteers, we are very much dependent on donations and charitable contributions. So again, if you can help either through donations or through your input, please let us know on either our Facebook group or our website. So with that, I say thanks very much, everybody, and goodbye.